Hello again, Reg audience. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about something that we know that you struggle with, and increasingly you're struggling with it. We're talking about IT governance. Why are we talking about that? Well, because the world is changing. Your businesses are changing faster than they ever have been before, and that stresses the governance that you got in place. It was never perfect, but now it really, some of you really are running into problems with it. So when we're talking about IT governance, who's in charge? Why are they in charge? Should they really be making the decisions? Indeed, do you know who is making the decisions about what you're doing? So if we were going to say why we're here, it's, what do we want? Flexibility. And what do we get? Confused and broken governance. So this is what the survey's telling us. Let's try and sort this out in the next hour. Who is going to help us sort it out, you ask? Well, I will tell you. So, new to the studio from Sungard Availability Services, Simon, welcome.
Hi, Tim.
Now, Simon, there's a couple of things I need to ask you. Sungard Availability Services, there are now two Sungards, aren't there?
Yes, indeed. So there's Sungard Data Systems Financial Services, which provides financial software to both the financial industry, banks and insurance, and there's availability services, and availability services indeed provides a multitude of managed service capability. And that ranges from the provision of co-location data center capability, which spans 45 data centers globally. So we have a significant footprint in both Europe and in North America. And then going through to kind of managed services, managed operating system and managed database and so forth, cloud infrastructure as a service, as well as recovery services as well. So
this is the sort of thing you have to go in and sort out with your customers? Yeah,
very much so, because the multitude of our customers are at the enterprise level. Indeed, around one of their forefront concerns around security, compliance. An example of such, we recently launched a very highly secure UK government platform based on Cisco and NetApp technology. And one of the things around that is obviously governance and security and compliance, specifically around data sovereignty and the UK confidential information to be held within the UK, which is obviously still the UK. Indeed, that's at the forefront of a lot of our customers.
All right, that's good. So we'll be going to be finding out later on today what the sort of things that you say to your customers, sort of things your customers say to you, and then who wins the argument after that. So Dale, as well, this is something that you get. I mean, because the thing with analysts, right, is that very often, it's nothing against analysts, but sometimes you kind of like people who will arrive after the bad things happened and say, see, I could have told you, I had a graph for that, I had a chart, but you actually get your hands dirty on this as well, don't you? Trying to help organisations.
Yeah, because sometimes when you run into some of the problems we're going to be talking about, it helps to have someone just come in and partially referee, partially mediate, but seriously to give a sort of different perspective and just get people away from their parochial view of the world. So it's quite good actually being able to go in and do that kind of thing, and it works quite well as an analyst because you're not. They know you're going to go away after a workshop, and you're not going to hang around for the next 3 weeks and look for the next 3 projects and so on. No. It's going to be one of those difficult ones, isn't it? Now, just to remind all of you guys, if you want us to talk about something, there is a way in which you can encourage us to do that, which is ask a question or make a point. You can see it on your interface. It's not too difficult. I'm not going to give you instructions for that, but do it, please do, because when you type it in, it comes out here, and I ask the guys, and they give a straight answer. And so please do. And if they're saying anything that you don't agree with, or if they're not getting into it enough or enough detail for you, remind us, and we'll take care of that for you. So please do ask questions. Now, let's get on with this. First of all, we sort of need to define our terms. I don't really like doing this very often, but this is something where there's a lot of people just really don't formally understand what we're talking about with IT. There's a lot of different conversations that seem like they're about the same thing, but this is what we mean by IT governance in all of this. Dale, what's on these things, these areas sort of cover more or less what you would consider to be IT governance?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's probably worth saying that a lot of people confuse the terms governance and compliance because they throw them into the same sentence, and a lot of people use them together. Governance is really about making sensible decisions. That's really what it boils down to. Compliance is quite often goes together, because quite often you need to make the right kind of decisions to be compliant with certain kinds of regulations and show that you've got the kind of control in place. But governance itself is independent of compliance. They're related, but in itself it just is good business sense.
Yeah, compliance will produce some elements of governance, but it's a bigger question than that is. Simon, these 5 areas, they're the areas that you consider to be, this encompasses the whole of IT governance for you?
Definitely so as well, and I think in terms of our audience today, obviously predominantly in the IT industry, I think one of the things which hopefully the audience will gather today is, it's not necessarily based around technology and technology decisions, because I think for good governance, the IT and the role of IT, as effectively what we're seeing is an evolution of that role of being a broker, has to start to understand the business and the benefits of the governance and some of the decisions they're going to be making on the basis of this foundation around the governance, indeed.
So just to reiterate that, IT governance is fundamentally a business requirement, not an IT requirement, even when it's applied to technology decisions.
Yes, which is something that, rather interestingly, we're going to come into, is where it ends up with the wrong people making the decisions on this. So what we've got is we've got needs against wants, how you define the services, how you the priorities and the ways in which you deliver those services, how you control how the money's spent, and how you measure whether that money's being used well. So.
Yeah, and again, I'll say this right up front. Simon is obviously focused on large organisations at the big end of the market, but pretty much everything we're talking about applies to any size of business.
Absolutely everybody.
And it may or may not be formal, so don't read into anything we're talking about that you need lots of paperwork and heavy policies and that kind of thing. This can be done on a relatively informal basis, but it's about being organised and aware and
sort of baking it into the decision-making process rather than making a decision and then working out whether or not.
So how much you formalise it is secondary to whether you do it.
And I think governance as well is going to be a lot more prevalent in terms of the audience today, especially around things like hybrid IT and the evolution of cloud services and consumerisation of IT as well.
Yeah, because this is something here's a diagram that you came up with, Dale, on this, which is basically what this means in real life. So you imagine these little arrows are coming from the last diagram, and what they, so it's what it implies.
Yeah, it's probably worth running through these, because, a lot of the work we do, and through a lot of research that we do as well, lots of people just have a very blinkered view of the world, so they see the world from their perspective, whereas in fact, IT governance is good decision making is dependent on looking at the same decision from lots of different angles, and that's really what this is about. So the top 3 there are about just looking at the business and user, what the business and user community are asking for. So you've got a business strategy, you've got quite often individual business units that have a view, and they may be different views actually between business units. We'll come and talk about that a little bit later. And then individual users have their own views on what should and shouldn't be done. So that's kind of like the high level input. That's almost like where you start with requirements. But then obviously to meet those requirements, you can solve the same problem in lots of different ways. So you can bring different technology options to bear. And even if you choose a particular technology, someone mentioned cloud delivery, for instance, you can deliver it hosted or on premise or through a managed service of some kind. So those kind of things need to be borne in mind. And the thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked, as we'll talk about, is the integration and operations practicalities. So any decisions you make have a consequence in terms of managing touchpoint, how easy or otherwise they are to integrate, whatever you put in place, how easy or otherwise it is to integrate with other things, to operate and manage, to support and so on. And then the bottom 3 are all really about the sort of hardcore sort of finance and risk side of things. So it's easy to throw money at solving a short-term problem, but actually, you really need to think a little bit longer term than that, because if everyone's just reacting in a sort of knee-jerk manner and solving short-term problems, then longer-term ROI tends to be undermined. And quite clearly, every organisation has funding and resource constraints. So you've only got a certain amount of budget and resource and man hours in a day to play with, and then risk constraints. You might be subject to regulation on the one hand, but also customer expectations on the other. So,
yeah, and we spoke, about that, the last week or so about what's more prevalent now is around social media. An example of such is, so if you have some risk and compliance requirements, as an IT, you've also got to consider from the business perspective around the brand of the organisation. I don't mean the kind of the logo or the strap line of an organisation. It's what is the kind of outside-in view of your organisation, because you are kind of a guardian of the business, and where we're starting to see consumerisation and where people want to use, for example, tablets and phones to access data, want to use notes like Evernote or OneNote. Obviously there is both intellectual property and obviously some element of confidentiality around that information that's being shared, so that the governance structure's got to be around the compliance as well.
So we're getting into, because I was just thinking that there'll be a bunch of people that are watching this and say, yeah, come on, tell me something I don't know. We sort of do all of these things. It's implicit in what we do. But there's bound to be a couple of surprising things that are going to show up for them if they looked in detail. Can you pick a couple of those out? You mentioned like this idea of people sort of collecting information together in things like Evernote and stuff like that. That tends to break governance?
Very much so. If, for example, if you look at kind of the governance elements, and it's going back to the conversation around kind of, you have to be aware, obviously, set the foundation around the governance, because it does feed into or feed out of a compliance need that you may have within your business. So an example of such, if you're a UK limited company, the directors of said company can be found liable around sovereignty and data protection indeed, and where a lot of these decisions are being made, which we'll see throughout the conversation today, is a lot of these decisions are being made from the C-level suite of going, oh, I want to use the greatest, iPhone, for example, right? I want it unrestrictive. That's then just suddenly being sent down to IT. It's like, go and sort it out, it's easy. But you have to understand, it's not just a technological device, it's where is the governance, where is the security, right? What can be shared from a data protection perspective across different platforms? So if you look at cloud, one of the things is around controlling your investment, right? You're going to make an investment in cloud, right? But somebody somewhere holds a budget within the organisation, which again, you have to have some governance and tracking of that investment, right? There are developers going out to use a third-party cloud provider like a Sungard or an Amazon. Where is that necessarily being quantified, and what's being developed out onto that platform as well?
So what Simon's alluded to there is the fact that this is all just common sense. And when IT was actually calling the shots on pretty much most technology deployment in the organisation, then all this stuff came quite naturally, and it was all just part of the process. Whether you did it formally or informally, it didn't really matter. But naturally, when you were making decisions, there'd be somebody in the mix who'd be the pivot point for that, and just make sure that all these different considerations were made or taken care of. And the reason we're here now talking about this today is that IT isn't now necessarily in control of all these things anywhere near as much as they used to be. So, or at least there's pressure to take that control away. So some people are hanging on in there, and they've got what we would call fortress IT, but that's not really sustainable. They're still under a lot of pressure. So rather than sit there and kind of dig your heels in and try and maintain control or regain control, the reason we're here today is to just sort of talk through some of the issues and how you might sort of approach governance in a bit more of a sort of distributed cooperative way.
Yeah, so if there is, for anyone who's watching this, if you have come up against some nasty surprises, or you've discovered something that you found to be basically ungoverned activity, please let us know what that is, because that's going to be useful for other people who are watching who haven't found it yet, unless you want them to have a nasty surprise as well.
I mean, it's referred to as a whole thing about shadow IT, so it's still, people say, oh, I don't necessarily worry about shadow IT. Well, you worry about it suddenly when you find it, and maybe because you've broken the compliance or you haven't stuck to the governance element, You know, it might be down to cost.
It might still be within your governance envelope, but if you don't know, you don't know. I got to the end of got to the middle of that sentence, had no idea what the end of it. You didn't tell that. Yeah, so.
And I think a lot of people know that something has to change, which is really what you're about
which
here.
is interesting. I mean, this report where it's around digital dynamics in the C-suite, which is, you know, towards the end of the conversation today, you'll see the link on the Reg website and being able to download the report as well as some of the reports from the analyst community as well, which said service providers fund the likes of analysts. Sorry, I have to come back on that one. But you know, if we look at kind of elements of this in terms of the report, you know, 38 response kind of around open to change if the market has been proven, and very much kind of IT is very much a kind of both incestuous and a small industry as well. I mean, amount of people which I'm sure the audience have, you know, worked with the past, you suddenly bump into the person, and you know that there is that incestuous nature of our industry, right? And it's very much around peer basis, especially around things like we're obviously in London today. In the financial community, there's the whole competition around banks for, you know, who brings the greatest and best technology, who adopts it first. There is that adoption process around, okay, if I see one of my peers adopting, you know, the ability to be open to change and it's been proven, then I'm more acceptable to kind of taking things like buy your own device and so forth. But you know, the other thing around here as well is obviously, you know, flexible and agile in their approaches and processes. I think this is the evolution of IT, specifically around more of being an IT broker of services. So it doesn't necessarily have to be invented here. You don't necessarily want to kind of change the way that you do or kind of reinvent the wheel, but you know, like the embracing cloud services, you know, IT, just because you haven't built it and you haven't put your server in the corner and, you know, done all the coding and built it yourself as a team, doesn't necessarily mean it's a wrong thing to go and use, for example, a cloud service, as long as you are defined around the needs and the wants of the business.
You need to be able to move with confidence and move quickly when you make a decision, not be hung up thinking, can we do this? Yeah. It's at the what is it, the blue and purple end of this, you've got people who are unable to change, who feel they are unable to change. And also what we're saying with this, where we come down to this, is to say IT governance is important because flexibility isn't one of those nice to have things anymore. It's, you know.
No, I think you have the need for agility as well, and it very much, we've seen it in particular verticals. So an example of such, we provide cloud services for the likes of CityLink, Monarch Airlines, Transit, which are one of the largest logistics providers, and they need the agility to be able to compete in a very competitive space. For example, there are other people from, you know, which can deliver parcels as well as CityLink. Monarch are trying to obviously sell tickets online for, you know, for holidays, whether it be on their planes or holidays itself, and they need the agility to be able to meet the market requirements, but they have to be governed within a very structured way to ensure that they meet the needs and the requirements and the strategy of the business, but are able to deliver from an IT perspective, the ability to be flexible, to be able to spin up a new instance, you know, whether it be on a cloud platform or, you know, a more of a physical capability on a database or so forth. But you know, they are kind of within that particular vertical, which needs that kind of agility and flexibility, but do need that structure and foundation of governance.
Mm-hmm. So on this chart, I mean, this is Simon's chart, but we've been tracking Reg Reader views in this area for quite a while. I think our first consumerization study, for instance, was about 4.5 years ago, and at that point we had probably about 10-12% of IT people that were saying, yes, we appreciate there has to be a lot more flexibility, we've got to take on board user preferences and desires in what we do more than we have done in the past. We've been tracking that, and our data pretty much agrees with this, the Reg Reader data, and that now the majority have kind of accepted that that's the case, that they can't really hold back anymore. We have to start letting go of certain elements of control and taking on board user opinion. And we're probably in the same kind of ballpark, actually. You know, about a third say, yeah, we've taken steps to start doing that proactively, with another third kind of saying, We haven't quite figured out how yet, but we know we need to.
We know we need to, but we're having a go. Now, yeah, so it's for people who have control of the change. What processes do you have in place here, which is really what we're going to be talking about the second half of our hour today, is how you put those processes in place.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one because obviously the high account here obviously kind of do track on an informed basis. I mean, I don't know necessarily...
What does that mean?
Which means if I don't tick a box and say that I don't track it, I could be in trouble. So, I mean, there is how much, in terms of the tracking on an informal basis, what's actually tracked? The big stuff? Right, because I'm sure there's other things within the organisation which necessarily isn't being tracked, right? And maybe a blind eye is turned, not because of the desire not to want to be able to track the capability. It may be down to resource or time, because you can't track necessarily everything, and that's why the need of governance as well is being able to go and speak to the business and be able to get buy-in, you know, and acceptance, rather than being kind of your IT being more of a change agent and rather than being a, oh, we can't do that type. Yeah. You know, from that perspective. So, I mean, in terms of kind of, yeah, there's obviously some element around kind of, you know, the track on an informal basis, and obviously looking towards kind of the next step as well is kind of, you know, what I said is around tracking of the large projects as well. And it's very hard to be able to automate some of these processes because there's fundamentally so much within the organisation from an IT perspective that you have to bring together and be able to have that visualisation and tracking and control. You know, but I think there is an element of kind of the baby small steps where if you're not tracking change, then start to track change. But again, going back to kind of the understanding the needs and the wants and the definition of the services and being able to meet the needs. So you have to have that at your forefront, not necessarily kind of, otherwise you're going to kind of lose the governance structure. You know, it's those 5 points which we raised at the start of the webcast.
Well, so I'm going to do a shout out to the guys here actually, because if you, I'm very interested in what this sort of informal tracking might mean, and I do appreciate that it's not always possible to put in a large program of, you know, a large formal governance program straight away, and that's not always suitable for what you want to do. But I'm interested if some of you have got some practical experience of just improving what you do, or just creating some kind of process which, while not being in a sort of like a huge bound volume on the shelf, is effective. Can you let us know about that if you do that, and we'll put it to the guys and see if they think that they think you're doing a good job. I'm sure you are. Right, so Dale, let's have a look at some of your research as well on this. So we've already mentioned a little bit that the users are becoming increasingly powerful now.
So what are they doing is what this chart is basically saying. So a lot of people talk about BYOD and bringing devices in. Yeah. And that's really what that first block of charts, first block of bars is about on the top bar. Basically what we asked here was, are you actually seeing a significant level of adoption of any of these things on this chart? Independently of the IT department. So this is basically users or business units, departments, divisions, etc., making their own decisions without actually involving IT in that decision making process.
Basically, more or less, everybody is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say at this stage that we deliberately said, you know, in terms of significant, it's too much to ignore. So that doesn't mean to say that, you know, there's a massive tide and everyone's totally lost control, because that's not right.
They're just noticing it.
It's just that, you know, the trend is gone beyond something that you can just deal with on an exception basis. You have to sort of take it seriously. So these bars are, you know, they're up towards, you know, they're well over 50%, and I think it's something like 80, 90%. We're seeing at least something in some of these areas. So everyone's seeing a little bit of something. So you've got devices at the top, and when it comes to devices, it's not just smartphones, it's not just tablets, but it's laptops, it's even home PCs and those kind of things are getting used. And then all those devices, they drag through software, whether it's apps on mobile devices, or whether it's even PC or Mac software. Users and departments are going out and buying their own stuff. And then obviously you've got the service pull through as well. So cloud services, as Simon mentioned, a lot of these devices come out of the box begging to be connected to the cloud. So it naturally follows through. And whether it's Evernote or whether it's iCloud or, you know, any department adopting a CRM system independently of IT. You know, all these things kind of fit into it.
Just don't put your photos on iCloud, especially the ones which
we're not we're not going there. Well, I have to say, if a product manager from Evernote's watching today, they might want to sort of, you know,
the thing is, though, is going back to kind of defining the services and needs. You know, something like Dropbox may be able to meet the needs that the service that you want to provide back to the business. But one of the things which you may want to ask yourself is, you know, people are obviously using a personal account. You know, for example, if you look at OneNote and Office 365, having a corporate account at least has the governance and the security and the structure. So if somebody were to leave the organisation, depending on what vertical you may be in, may have competitive information about said organisation, move to a competitor, you don't necessarily want that shared outside of the organisation.
So it's an element of governance. It's not just a snapshot of what's happening now, it's the consequences of that in the future.
Indeed, it's going back to the, don't think about the here and now, think about further down the line, not just on the investment, but the what-ifs as well.
We've got the shortest and the loudest question that we've ever had from Greg here. Right. And I'm just going to throw a word in here, because I'm not sure actually what Greg means. He says, baselining, ! As I'm assuming this is one of his ways of doing practical governance. Yeah, well, baselining is a general principle. Thank you, Dale. I thought you were going to help me out. So I mean, there's a perennial problem in IT decision making, which is, you know, everyone talks about ROI and TCO improvement and stuff like that, but in comparison to what? I mean, where are you starting from? Yes. And well, from the baseline. From a baseline, obviously. How you actually get to a baseline is quite an interesting one. I mean, you can do it at various different levels. You know, there's lots of clever technology which allow you to sniff your network and see what devices are hooked up, even which services people are logging into, you know, which websites are accessing. Which applications go to which storage systems and so forth. Exactly. So you can get a view of the kind of activity that's going on. We're going to be talking a little bit later on about, you know, just simply talking to people. And you know, sometimes you can get a pretty good view just by going and having a nose around what the marketing department's doing, or what they're doing in legal, or whatever. Because all these guys are, you know, tempted to go out and do the kind of things that Simon was talking about a minute ago. Yeah. I've just got another comment here. We might not deal with all of it straight away now, but I want to get it. I want to put it out there. It's from Jan or Jan, depending on location and sex. By change, do you mean benefits, identification, and management? My experience is that businesses are very reluctant to identify quantifiable benefits which they own and are responsible for the delivery of. So, you know, they're not putting themselves forward to say, you know, this is what it should be doing. Yeah. And are we going to give some advice on how to overcome that? We are. Can we park that one until we get onto our triangle later? But it's there as a challenge to you. And if you haven't, so there, it's there. And if they haven't answered it, send us a follow-up. Yeah. Good. Let's move on, because we've got a couple of what some Reg readers said. Now, as I understand it, the fundamental part of this, the thing that they're saying in this slide is, it's okay to say no to people just because they want things. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I see it in the press all the time. I even see analysts actually writing, you know, users are defining their own requirements. And the sort of implication is that users actually know what's best for themselves and for the business, which anyone who's been in IT for long enough knows that that's a pretty dodgy foundation to work on. So it really is about sort of, and we'll get on to some of the techniques for doing this in a minute, but separating out user desires from actual business needs, for example, is an important part of that. And what this comment is saying is, look, we've got situations where people are bringing kit into our organisation that just isn't compatible with our systems. You know? There's nothing we can do about it without a big integration job. But it's, you know, because I mean, how long have we been in IT? Is IT are there when things go wrong and always get blamed when things go wrong. It's when they do the good things they hardly get the praise, which they should do. But it's the same thing as exactly what you said here. Is kind of. And there's loads of comments we get. You know, that we had. I mean, this is a very lively study, I can tell you. We got lots of feedback. You know, people saying, if only they'd asked before they actually bought the bloody thing in the first. Sorry. You say that. That's all right. But yeah, actually, that was a direct Reg quote. So in which case it's definitely okay. It's one of the milder ones. If only they'd asked before coming along, and then. You know, we end up looking like the bad guys because we have to say, I'm sorry, you can't use that. You know, we can't physically make it work, therefore. And then you get situations like, another example is a department that's gone down the route of
maybe putting a CRM system in place, and then suddenly they realise they actually need a feed from another system or a link to another.
Yeah.
And no one's actually thought about how that's going to work. So it happens at different levels.
Which goes back to kind of assessing the needs and the wants. Is actually it's not a bad thing to assess the needs, go and speak to kind of essentially your customers across the organisation, and there may be an element where you actually put the structure around the governance of certain different types of technology around, say, for example, the smartphones. Is yes, you can use the following 3 or 4 smartphones, but we're actually going to put some software on your smartphone to ensure that we are tracking the application usage. I use an iPhone, Sungard provides me an iPhone. We have mobile security on there. It governs what applications can be loaded and what can't be downloaded. Same as you have the whole thing around the consumerization is an iPhone can carry music. Who holds the copyright of that? So we can't have music on our devices. So again, it's just, iPhone is great. I have mobile capability. I love the iPhone. There's people which want Android. But having that structure and that, say, here are the defined devices that you can use is kind of meeting the end user halfway between.
So this idea of security and responsibility and that sort of thing. Look at this scary chart. This is your scary chart, isn't it, Dale? Yeah.
It is, actually. So, I mean, the question is really important here. If you have activity taking place independently of IT, that's all the stuff we've just been looking at.
Yep.
Where does responsibility fall for things like security, compliance and data protection? So remember, this is where IT hasn't been involved, doesn't have control.
All this new stuff that we're saying is going on and that we've already established that is happening in about 9 out of 10.
So in a third of cases, IT is still in control, or still regarded as being responsible.
Regarded as being in control, right?
Well, they're not in control necessarily, but they're still lumbered with the responsibility to manage something that they've had no control over or influence in whatsoever. And then if you look at some of the other things here, you've got a mixture of control being in dubious places. Probably the worst place for it to be is with individual end users in terms of responsibility for the reasons that no one needs telling, I don't think, on this Webcast.
Yeah.
To a combination, which may be good if you do that in an organised way, but the old adage that if multiple people are responsible for something, that's no better
who is actually responsible for it. Yeah.
Yep.
And then you've got quite a big chunk here, 15% or so, saying that responsibility just isn't well defined. Regardless of the specific responses to this question, the big risk is that when people are making IT decisions in a relatively uncontrolled way, without necessarily any sort of technical background, technical discipline or knowledge, they don't know what they don't know. Therefore, they make some interesting decisions which may not necessarily be the right ones for them or for the business. But ultimately, responsibility for the consequences of those decisions just falls between the cracks if you're not careful. So we end up with a lot of risks floating around the organisation that nobody even acknowledges, let alone tries to manage.
So we're not necessarily saying that it should be in one place, that one of these bars should be 100% at all. We're not saying anything like that. What we are saying is, the very bad ones are the ones where it's just not being taken care of at all.
Now remember that this data, I mean, it's all very well looking at stats, but when we do these reg studies, for instance, I can tell you, I sat and I read through something like 80 pages of comments just on this question from reg readers, giving stories and anecdotes, and it's pretty clear that a lot of the time responsibility is just sort of evaporating into the void. So
yes, yeah. So there we are, the responsibility void. Now and here's a quote from it. So yeah, the idea that individual needs, they come second. So wanting is not the same thing as needing, and needing has to be defined by the organisation first, taking account of what the users want.
Yeah. So I think the best way of putting it is users think very parochially. They see what's immediately in front of them. They want to solve that problem. But what they don't realise in solving that problem, for instance, I like using this Apple equipment with this kind of application because it makes me feel more productive, man, kind of thing. But actually, in doing that, they're creating all kinds of compatibility problems with their colleagues that are all on different platforms. Now,
you put "man" on the end of that sentence because you're talking about Apple. You just got to get over it.
You've got to be cool. Yeah.
No, but it's a
serious problem.
No, it's a serious problem.
They solve an immediate problem, but they create lots of support problems for IT, cost problems because they've just spent a lot more money solving that problem than they actually needed to. and also maybe sort of problems in terms of data interchanges. And
right, so you've got this atomization of, you know, people might end up doing the same thing in different places, but they're doing it in different ways, some of which are more appropriate than others, which actually, I think this... Oh, by the way, Greg's clarified what he was talking about, sort of baselining. He's saying, you know, you establish your baseline, you follow that by compliance, gap analysis, and monitoring change against agreed thresholds.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, that seems a very sensible way.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So almost, I mean, I've heard some people talk about an amnesty. You know, let's flush out in each department, you know, what is it that you're relying on.
Sensible.
And then, you know, once you got it there, you can... you know, the two options are, if someone's using something and it's become an important part of the business, but it's kind of totally unofficial, you either say, well, let's put our arms around it and make sure that it ticks the right compliance boxes if that's relevant. You know, we've assessed it from a security point of view and we've made sure that the right measures are in place for that. And it's actually supportable, so when the user phones the IT help desk, we know about it and we can actually answer questions sensibly on it. The other thing is to say, well, actually, it's fundamentally a consumer solution that isn't really fit for business, but obviously you identified a need there. So you might look at actually saying, look, you really can't carry on using that, but let's put a system in place that's a bit more robust, you know, a little bit more enterprise class.
And has something in common with it.
It does the same thing, yeah.
And again, if the other thing which I've seen as well is when you're looking at the due diligence of that, saying, okay, this element of technology is not right, but it needs to be more of an enterprise level for a corporation, is it doesn't necessarily have to do everything. It can be the 80-20 rule, because at some point you're going to have to make a decision. Where I've seen so many projects go on for far too long because they're trying to go for the
rack in all these extra features that are very hard to do.
As long as you're working with a provider or a supplier, whether you're going to go and use that from a third party or actually bring it in-house, being able to do the due diligence in rightfully around, okay, does it meet my needs? Does it meet the cost profile? Does it meet all of the baselines? No?
So what we're going to do is now we're going to sort of look at both of your experiences in how we solve, practically how you solve some of these problems when you're in the organisations. Your first point here, Dale, is that it is quite possible to solve these problems.
Yeah, definitely. It just means that whereas absolute centralised control, which I think was a little bit of a myth anyway, you know, there's always been people doing stuff with PCs and PC software and things over the years. But most things in IT were controlled. You know, we need to have coordinated distribution of control, but coordinated being the operative word. So here's a good example on this one, for instance. This comes up quite often in some of the work that we do. You go around the table, you've got various business units.
Yep.
Yeah, it's quite common for people to talk about IT and the business as if the business is just one thing. But actually, you get a bunch of people from different departments sitting around a table. All these business people have got different views, different perceptions, different requirements, and so on. Interestingly, though, if you let everyone just freewheel and solve their own problems, just take your simple example, Simon, note-taking. One department chooses Evernote, another department chooses OneNote, another department chooses to do it in email, shared folders, and you know, another chooses Google, say Google Doc. There are different ways of solving exactly the same problem, and if everyone's doing it differently, that can actually cause issues. So from simple procurement
point of view, fundamental issue it's going to cause is that you're going to end up with an inability to share information. That's going to be one of the things in IT governance.
Exactly. In other contexts, you end up with you just pay over the odds for everything because you've got no sort of purchasing power. So everyone sort of buys their own thing in a very inefficient way, and it creates a support problem because these things fundamentally always go wrong. And then they always end up calling the help desk, and now your help desk agents have to understand how to troubleshoot 5 different systems as opposed to 1 or 2.
But we're reiterating the point again that the compliance is just one aspect of that, isn't it? Because we've got cost, we've got interoperability, we've got support,
business
and
efficiency.
they're all efficiency. They're all parts of
business visibility.
So let's so this so here we are. This is your schematic of good decision making, Dave.
It is, and I mean this isn't rocket science, right? But it sort of sets the ground for what we're trying to get to. This is the sort of
process. If you get everyone together around that table, this is the sort of process we're going to have to go through.
So the first point that I think has to be accepted by IT departments nowadays is it's things are not just driven by hardcore business needs. You cannot ignore user preferences and desires. I think that we're beyond being able to ignore that. With consumer tech and cloud and everything else we talked about. Yeah. So just accept that that's an input into the process. It shouldn't necessarily be a dominant input, but it should be one that's taken seriously. Yeah. And then you go into the decision-making process, but that's where you start bringing in your other, let's call them constraining or rationalising factors. So does it fit with our overall strategy, whether it be business strategy or IT strategy? That's an important question.
So what are we talking about for a strategy there? What does that mean?
Well, if the organisation, just take a really
simple example. Is that a technology strategy or a business strategy?
It could be. Let's take technology strategy first, and don't read into this any sort of endorsement or anything of any product, but if the organisation is standardised on Office 365 and paid, gone through all the due diligence and justified that in all kinds of different ways, and then a department decides to use Google Apps, you're kind of out of whack with the corporate strategy. It could be the other way around, by the way. Both do the job, but you really, as much as possible, want to be choosing one or the other, because that way you get all the sharing and everything else.
Choosing one is better than, even if it's the second best,
Which is key as well, which we've seen and I've seen throughout my career in IT as well, is IT folk generally jump to the technical decision first. I've got the solution before understanding, if we look at the chart, these requirements gathering feed into the technical decision. Now, the other thing in terms of when you are going across the business as well, which I've very much seen kind of from an IT perspective, some 95% of people in the organisation don't understand geek language, right? They don't understand because they're looking at the business problems or the strategy from a business perspective. So as kind of the guardians of IT, you do need to obviously understand the ones and zeros of the technology, but you do kind of have to alleviate that and lift that up to kind of being able to speak with the business as well, and how that after looking at the business needs, the user desires and so forth, and then picking a technology, whether it be Google or Office 365 or whatever, right? These are the requirements that I've gathered, these are the decisions that we've made, and this is the decision that we need to do from an IT perspective. And you need to get buy-in from the C-level as well, which you'll start to see in kind of the digital report at the C-level that we've written.
So an example of a business view of strategy and how this impacts in this context is, let's say your business strategy is you've got various product lines and different divisions manage different product lines, and as part of your business strategy you want to get as much cross-selling and upselling as possible going between these different elements of your product portfolio. It doesn't make sense for those two divisions to make their own independent decisions, and these guys to go with Salesforce.com and these guys to go with Dynamics CRM.
Yep.
It will be a damn sight better if they were both on the same CRM system. Similarly, if your strategy says, we want to look after the customer throughout the whole customer cycle, if the sales guys choose Salesforce.com and the service guys choose Dynamics, and then the logistics guys use SAP or Oracle or something else, now you've got a disjoint there, which is at odds with your business strategy. So that's what that's about. It's about standing back and saying, let's put this decision in context, and offering up those decisions against, does it support that strategy or undermine it?
Question, does the IT department, the CIO, the IT director, whatever, then run this process? Because someone has to be given, sometimes there'll be disappointing things that have to be conveyed based on a sound technical reasons, and so someone has to have the authority to be able to say within the room, in that case we can't do it.
It depends on the organisation. In large organisations you tend to have programme managers that sort of fulfil that kind of role, and obviously those are the guys that are touch points with.
It very much kind of exactly the size. If you're obviously within SME, generally the IT person also does finance, also does other areas of the business as well. And obviously, the larger the organisation, then you start to get, a CSO or a CIO, CTO, and they have their different disciplines. But the larger the organisation, generally, you have to get the buy-in from the C-suite in general. Yeah. You'll see that kind of driven from our report.
It's why we said at the beginning, these are business decisions, they're not necessarily IT
decisions, because they might not be located within the IT department.
In a smaller organisation, it could be the IT manager just going up and knocking on the door of the MD and having a quiet word and saying, did you realise Mary in sales is wants to use a different system to Joe in services, and that doesn't make much sense.
Again, going back to the idea that this isn't necessarily a huge bureaucratic process that we're going through on all of this. Let us know who makes the decisions when you're doing this, please do. I'm going to skip over risk and regulation. We talked about that quite a lot. I just want to talk a little bit about the operational impact here. Again, I'm thinking through, what's operational impact? How do you measure that? That's a very slippery term.
So a really, really simple example is just take IT support. So someone's made it, because IT support is part of operations, someone's made a decision to bring something into the business. IT knows nothing about it, don't have the skills, the expertise and so on. You've got some overhead there, a negative operational impact. Another one is you bring something in, it needs to be coordinated with something else in the infrastructure, and someone needs to manage that synchronization on an ongoing basis. It could be data syncing between two systems. Well, actually, you don't particularly want that problem if you can avoid it. But that could be an operational impact and need to sort of put some middleware in place to, and then you need to look after that middleware and nurture it and maintain it and so on.
Yeah, it's the full support process. I mean, it's actually keeping the, is it highly available? Can we back up the data? Can we import, export the data? You know, it's not just obviously just, it's a whole range of aspects around the impact as well, especially if you're kind of in, either whether you're in-house or if you actually offshore select source some of that capability, you may have a third party which provides some element of your operational support. How do you have the governance around the structure there as well?
Financial impacts, I mean, one I came across recently with someone was, one big division was saying we want to cut loose from the mothership and go away and outsource our IT and bringing, make our own arrangements. But only 2 years previously, the organisation had brought some extra headcount into IT and centralised a whole bunch of stuff in the internal IT department, beefed up the network and put a bunch of stuff in place. That money has been spent. If these guys go off and do their own thing, it doesn't matter whether, whether that's the right thing or wrong thing, but somebody needs to consider that you're then left with a whole bunch of assets.
You've got some sunk costs.
You've got some sunk costs, exactly.
Yeah. Which, yes.
You might decide that it's worthwhile going in that direction, but you've at least got to consider it and acknowledge it. And when people are thinking parochially, they tend to ignore those kind of things. That's not my problem. I just want to do a run.
They wrap governance around their own.
Totally.
Exactly.
Which is happening kind of, if you look at cloud and you look at the advent of things like DevOps in the organisation, where you're going to go and want to be agile and flexible. So I'll go and use a third-party public cloud. I'll go and develop. And they look at the third-party public cloud like an Azure or an Amazon Web Services, look at it from a black and white perspective. It's really cheap, right? And then actually start to use it for 2-3 months, work out they have to import and output data outside of that third-party public cloud, bring it back into the business because they need to put it onto their production systems because they're supporting the life cycle. Is actually then suddenly 3 months down the line, because they've been using a credit card, suddenly getting a bill for £20,000 because the third-party provider has charged them for the input and output of their data, whereas they looked at the structure of the pricing, going, this is how much RAM.
They looked at what they could see, and then they don't.
And then start to work it, and somebody's got to pick up that credit card bill at the end of the day, and they go back to IT, and they didn't know anything about it. So
good. So let's have a look. Let's move on. I want to have a look at Dale's pyramid of governance. You use this as an exercise internally, don't you? When you go to sort of companies.
Well, it's a bit of a tip. Whether you use this or some equivalent of this doesn't really matter.
There's no fee for people who do use it.
No. But so the first thing when you've let's just say we notice more and more organisations drifting into a degree of conflict as a result of all the things we've been talking about. So at some point you've got to get people sitting around a table. Whether you do that physically or metaphorically doesn't really matter. You've got to get people talking. And then when you do that, that previous chart makes it look nice and easy, but actually you'll get lots of differences of opinion because people are looking at things from different perspectives. So what I always do is just stick this triangle up on a flip chart somewhere in the corner, and what it does is say, look, we've got to be clear that user preferences and desires are not always the same as hardcore business needs. They may be the same, but they may not be the same, and we need to tease those apart when necessary.
You need to make an explicit statement of how much each side is going to be accommodated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the IT delivery and operational stuff is, those operational implications, which can be significant.
Yep.
You can't ignore those. So when you're talking through, when you've got an apparent conflict between people, just use this as a tool and say, well, look, if we were to offer that up against this, which of these boxes does it tick? Are we really talking about hardcore business need here? In which case, it may be that the IT guy saying, "Oh no, that's going to be a real problem to actually support." They may have to compromise and say, "Well, but it is a hardcore business need, and the one at the top always has to take precedent," and that gives you. So it kind of balances things, and it just helps you to just look at things from other people's perspectives, and that's what this is about, really.
Yes.
It's a.
Does it work?
Compromise it does work.
It does work.
Compromise is not a dirty word. I hear this all the time, going, we don't want to compromise. If compromise is bad. But if you don't compromise, you end up with chaos and conflict. So this is about trying to get people to look at things from different perspectives. And usually, with grown-ups, most of the time, that when you put the other point of view, they can see.
I mean, nobody's going to get everything that they want all the time, are they?
No.
Simon? I mean,
but I think they need to put a kind of a weighting factor against each of these different elements. I mean, when you say obviously people don't necessarily get what they want all the time, one of the things I've personally seen over the last few years is the advent of things like iPads and Macs and so forth, and being able to actually use that as a tool to actually acquire talent to your business, because the kind of new generation are expecting the ability to have elements of consumerization within the business. You don't want to kind of be going from a kind of a governance perspective of no to everything, or a governance perspective of, well, there is no governance and we're going to basically allow everything.
So yes to everything. We're having a great time. Yeah.
Is that balance against the
Yes.
kind of those different needs and from the business and the kind of desires?
The ones I like when you do these kind of things, the conflicted business manager is always an interesting one. They sit there 1 minute and they're thinking as a user, and they're starting to talk about the devices that they're allowed to use and why are they forced to use this, and life would be so much easier if only they could use their iPhone or whatever. And the next minute they're talking about well, actually it's really critical that we're able to share information, and that we've got immediate access to this, that and the other, and then the conversation comes about, well, actually what you've just described is in direct conflict, so which should take precedent, you with your business manager hat on or you with your user hat on.
Yep.
And you do get this schizophrenic kind of behaviour and mindset coming out quite often.
If you locate exactly, like you say, from the weighting, where in this triangle that ideally people would like to be, and you can hold up their behaviour and say, well, it's actually in a completely different place of the triangle, that will help drive decision making, won't it?
Yeah.
Another thing that helps drive decision making is the exact relationship that we've got between IT and the various bits of the business. Dale, I'm assuming you're going to say that the one on the left is not good.
That's usually where people like us and
the one in the
you
middle
guys get involved. So you don't want to be on the left. That's obviously the starting point for quite a lot of sort of review processes. The middle one and the right hand one are both legitimate.
Yeah.
The middle one basically says we're going to have a service provider type relationship, and the SLA. The service provider could be internal and or external,
totally.
Or it could be a mixture.
Yep.
It's just that you've got a kind of a service level agreement sitting in the middle of IT and business. That's your kind of pivot point for decision making.
If you do this for us, we'll do this for you.
Exactly. So you get into kind of a negotiation kind of dialogue between the various parties. The one on the right is different in that that's more of a sort of partnership view. And if you've got a very heavily IT-centric business, probably the one on the right is more appropriate than the one on the left. If IT is something that supports the business, but it's an enabler as opposed to necessarily a business differentiator, then being in the middle is perfectly fine. I mean, there's no right or wrong between the middle and the right. You need to make your own judgment.
The one on the right allows you to sort of evolve and create new services with compliance baked into them. Is that what we're saying?
Exactly. And sometimes it's down to personalities. I mean, if you've got a strong...
Compliance governance baked into them. Sorry,
Exactly.
I'm making a mistake now. Yeah.
So the difference between the right and the middle is the right on the right hand side you've got a joint strategy and plan.
And interesting enough, from a kind of a service provider to our customers, obviously generally being structured in the middle, what we're actually seeing kind of the evolution is of the two, right? And very much from a service provider model of going almost down to the economics of kind of price versus quantity, actually having the fact that I can have a strategy and be a partner rather than going, I'm your customer, you're a service provider, it's actually you're a partner, I'm a partner, how are we going to work together for the next 3 to 5 years?
You don't get in that thing of sort it out for me, I want to do this, which is always, you know, always a problem, isn't it?
The reason it's worth having this is because it gets people to agree, how do we want to work together? Once you've actually sat around a table and you've agreed that, then you can much easier call out behaviour which doesn't actually fit what you've agreed, and then you can say, well, actually, you're behaving a little bit like you want us to be a service provider because you're just telling us that you're not interested in our advice. Is that what you want, or do you want us to sort of tell you what we've learned from the last 3 conferences on collaboration solutions, for instance? You know, if you just want to go, you want us to just say yes to what you've just asked for, that's fine, but we know that there are some other interesting things going on in the market. It's up to you.
Which goes back very pointedly towards the strategy and the plan, because what we're talking about today isn't just necessarily, governance, I'm done. You know, we sit there, you've got to have, this has got to be an evolving process. You've got to meet with your end users and so forth on a regular basis, whether it be, you know, on a quarterly basis or twice a year, just to say, and you've got to kind of have that, you know, going back to the baselines, you've almost got to have a KPI against, you know, is this being successful? The decision that we've made together, is it the right decision for the business? You know, because not every decision is going to be right. You know?
For example, the baseline that Greg was suggesting can be used in any of these environments, but it just changes the way in which that is negotiated. We're getting to the last 5 minutes now, so if you have anything, if you made this work, let us know. If we've missed anything out, it's your last call on these ones. We've got, because we are in the last 5 minutes, we've just got a few sort of checklist type scenarios, and we'll just look at them briefly. Remember, you can get hold of of our deck here if you want to steal all of the guys' best ideas. It's not stealing, really. We've made them available to you. But we've got some general principles here. We don't want to go through all of them, but if there's just something that you would you'd pull out of this, Dale?
Well, one that I find, you know, enlightening, but also just intellectually interesting is a lot of now turning to the research we do. You know, the large-scale surveys that we've done for, you know, a decade or more. If I think back over all of that research, a lot of what we do is we correlate behaviour with results. And one of the things we've noticed over the years is that you can ask questions in any way you want, you can look at any type of communication, but the more communication there is between IT and business people in any form, the more they talk to each other, basically, up and down the hierarchy.
So you're not saying like having big formal meetings? It's
not
just...
at all. Not at all. This could be IT guys just sitting next to business guys, or wandering or making a point
walking around and making themselves,
or sitting in the coffee room together or whatever, through to kind of more formal mechanisms, secondment and But anyway, it doesn't really matter. The more communication there is, the more effective this whole process is. It's not rocket science, but it's amazing how many people, you know, you go into organisations where IT just sits in a corner somewhere. Not only are they in a corner, they're in the most horrible corner in the building, and that doesn't do much for their credibility, their image. They don't get out and socialise with people. They don't. By socialise, I mean that in the loosest sense. Have beers, and but also just go and have a chat with people and get to know what's going on.
I think there needs to be that bi-directional collaboration where actually IT need to understand the business, and the business actually needs to help IT understand the business as well. So I see very much normally the barrier is, oh, you're just the IT folks, you just need to work out the systems up and running, you know. But yeah, they need to understand where the business.
You can't do in that circumstance. You can't do any of the fancy things we've been talking about before, can you?
There's loads of technologies and techniques and methodologies that help with that. Some of them are listed here, but they all boil down to basically, you know, just working together.
Now, the IT business, the tactical part of the IT business relationship. This is looking on the being a good citizen, really.
This is being realistic. I mean, sometimes the phrase I use is someone's got to be the grown-up and make the first move. And it's easy to sit there because, you know, users abuse IT quite often, and business heads do. You can sit there, you can get defensive, you can get aggressive. It's better to sort of say, okay, well, let's just listen to what's bothering these guys, and we'll address that. Whether it's right or wrong, their fault, our fault, let's put that to one side and let's just address it, because you know, there are some fundamental things sometimes that, you know, don't quite work right, and it may be because IT's been given the wrong steer by the business or whatever. Doesn't matter. Go and fix it. Get the gripes out of the way, and actually, you know, start to engage. If you got to that position where you got a bit of a rift building up between IT and business people, which is more and more common nowadays. And if necessary, work on the IT team's image. If they're sitting in a corner, you know, they never get out, get them out. Force people to go and...
Okay, now I just want to look on the last one here, because there's an interesting thing on the last one here, Simon. That a governed transition of power and control to the business units may be appropriate. So actually it might turn out on the back of this that IT does less, is in control of less when it comes to IT governance.
That's it. It's kind of being the IT broker. It's not. You don't have to control everything. I think you need to know about everything, but again, being the enabler will help the business to say, okay, yeah, you can go and use this application. But going back to what I said is, you know, if you want to go and use this device, here are the 3 or 4 things that we are happy to allow because we support it. It can be secured. It can be structured. So again, I think there is an element of being able to relinquish the power back to the business on certain elements of the IT, as long as you get a good governance and proactive, and again, be the enabler within the business.
And the good news is the technology is allowing you to do that more and more. Self-service systems, you know, the ability to delegate, provisioning new users and changing permission. All the kind of
because you've got good visibility about what's going on, and you can put rules in place.
Exactly, and cloud systems, modern packages, they all kind of allow you to let things go a little bit more and let users take a bit more
finally
control.
A Webcast which says you can end up doing less rather than doing more, isn't it? I'm going to leave us with these, with our further reading on this. And just to remember everyone, if you don't do governance right, then your director might end up getting fined or even worse. So it's definitely something that's worth taking on. Guys, we've reached the end of our time here today. I hope it's been good for you. I hope you managed to say everything you wanted to say.
Indeed.
Yeah?
So yeah, it's a big topic, but I think we covered most of it.
Well, there's many more hours of this, isn't there? But unfortunately not for now. So Simon, Dale, thank you very much for coming in. And I've been Tim Phillips, and from the Register, goodbye.